Again. Hi, everybody. Hello. Hi, everybody. How's your morning been? Anybody been talking crap about me? Wherever Gary is. Thank you, Gary. Gary's one of my favorites. How's everybody feeling? Great. We're going to get into a panel, the purpose of which is going to be to put some interstitial, some connective tissue on all of these really great blocks of information that we've been discussing over the past couple days. We have an insane panel. I said yesterday, insane in every definition of the word. I said yesterday that I've been wanting to have this conversation for like 10 years. Specifically, this kind of a panel with these kind of human beings is the conversation that I think has needed to be put into place to really give some context for a lot of the things that we're talking about. So I cannot wait to dig in. One of the ways we're going to start is we're going to talk about, we've covered already that there are a lot of very specific myths about MSG that have been problematic, and rather than dismissing them and hiding from them, each panelist is kind of perfectly tailored based on their background to talk about it and dig into exactly what there is to say there that hasn't already been said. And then once we get through that as a way of introduction, we're going to dig into some of the bigger picture issues around, great, there's this science, what do we do about it? Or what is remaining? What do we still need in order to tie a bow on this conversation and move on to the next iteration? So Harold, would you get us started and tell us your official title as guru of all things food science and dig in?
All right. So my name is Harold McGee, and I've been writing about the science of food and cooking since the mid-'70s or so, which is only 10 years after the New England Journal of Medicine story about Chinese restaurant syndrome. So I kind of grew up in writing about food with that. And I was assigned the myth, MSG is an unnatural ingredient. And I think we had several hours yesterday of conversation about and evidence that that is simply not the case. And I don't think I really need to re-argue that. I mean, if it's in mother's milk and in many delicious things, and in fact all living things to one degree or another, then it's natural, it's out there, right? So what I thought I would do instead of going over that same territory is just talk about my experience in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with the growing understanding of umami and MSG, because it seems to me that that's part of what is going to need to happen in the next few years, is that kind of something like a conversion experience. So I'll just explain what happened. I wrote this book about the chemistry of food and cooking in the mid-'70s, late 70s, and wrote a little bit about MSG and about the Chinese restaurant syndrome. And even then, early 80s, it was clear that there really wasn't good evidence for it being a real thing, so I wrote that. But for me, MSG was kind of a fringe ingredient because it was an issue in Chinese food, not so much for most standard American cooking. So I didn't pay that much attention to it until the late 1990s, mid to late 1990s. I can't remember exactly when it was, when I did a beefsteak tasting with a wonderful food writer named Jeffrey Steingarten. And he arranged for a tasting of steaks that had been aged 1 month, or unaged basically, and then 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. And we sat there and we made sure that the outsides of the steaks were cut off, so we were only tasting the inside. And long story short, when we got to the 2-month age steak and put it in our mouth, we just looked at each other and went bug-eyed. because it was so different. And that's the moment, that was my conversion experience, when I understood what umami was all about. And it wasn't something that we could put our fingers on in a very specific way. It was just the general depth of flavor and the length of flavor, and we would start talking with each other after we took the bite and then pause and say, I'm still tasting it. It's still there, even though I swallowed it 30 seconds ago. So right around that same time, fortunately for both of us, the idea of umami became more current among culinary professionals, and it was largely due, I would say, to Dr. Ninomiya's publication in, I think, 1998 of this wonderful compendium of information about the glutamate contents and ribonucleotide contents of all kinds of foods and materials. And that made a huge impression on the chef world. In fact, I was told about Dr. Ninomiya's paper not by an academic, but by a chef, by Heston Blumenthal. And so umami became of interest. Chefs began to perceive it in a way that they'd never perceived before. There was great excitement over understanding what makes a lot of Western food delicious, which was unavailable to us before because we didn't have this key piece of understanding. And the world changed for professional cooks. And it seems to me that that's kind of what needs to happen on an individual level from here on out. You can tell people intellectually what MSG is and that it's out there and that it has these effects, but until people actually have the experience of what a difference it makes to the flavor of foods, I think it's not going to be as easy a sell as we would want.
So as with everything, making it personal is kind of the only way forward.
Yeah, and also simply making the argument that when it comes to natural and unnatural, I mean, it's human nature to want to make food delicious. That's our nature, is we want delicious food. And MSG is a tool that allows us to do that. And in its own way, I would say, because it is everywhere, we've just kind of pulled it out and concentrated it. It's as natural, but I would say more natural than boiling or frying or many other things we do to foods to make them delicious.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to come back to a couple of things there. Mary Lee, would you care to take us on to the next myth?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. I'm Mary Lee Chin. I'm a registered dietitian, and I do consulting work on a lot of food issues, particularly provocative issues, and MSG is no exception to being provocative. Now, I speak here as a dietitian of over 40 years, so I'm very used to taking a look at research. And my topic is assigned Myth, MSG is hazardous to your health. So I've taken a lot of the research to really show that MSG is indeed a very safe ingredient. But I also bring to the table the fact that I have been Chinese all my life, even though I've only been a dietitian 40 years. I'm the sister of a Chinese restaurant owner who, until recently when he retired, owned the second largest Chinese restaurant on Long Island, and I've cooked Chinese food my whole life. As you can see from this photograph, my mom and dad are also Chinese. And we had in our kitchen MSG. And I remember my mom, every time she cooked a dish, putting it on the food. And in our kitchen, it was as universal as salt, pepper, ketchup, and salsa is in your kitchen. The FDA says that the average intake of glutamate is about 13 grams per day from food sources. But added glutamate in the Western culture is less than, well, just about half a gram per day. And it's such a low amount. And referencing Jeffrey Steingarten, whom you spoke about, who was a very famous food writer for Vogue magazine, he wrote an article published in 1999, I believe, that said, if MSG is so bad, why doesn't everybody in China have a headache? And when we take a look at the myths, there are so many divisive and emotional exchanges about the safety of MSG. When Chinese restaurant syndrome was first publicized, the claim was that Chinese restaurants used it to alter the flavor of very bad ingredients, and that they were using lavish or large amounts, though no studies were ever done to actually show how much was used. And the claim was that it caused headaches, dizziness, nausea, including one psychologist who claimed that his wife was subject to violent rages every time she ate in a Chinese restaurant. So I think it's really important to take a look at the scientific peer-reviewed study to see what it really says. And one of the things about it being toxic to the nervous system or causes of dizziness or headaches was that original study from Olney. So I want to put it in perspective. He injected or force-fed neonatal mice large amounts of MSG. And if we were to translate that into human consumption, it would be, at the largest level, the equivalent of a 70-kilogram man eating 3 jars of MSG at one time. That's just not realistic in terms of how people eat food. And of course, a lot of the boluses of MSG that produce the neurotoxic effects was based on the fact that it was eaten without food. And we don't eat MSG that way. So in terms of taking a look at the comprehensive compilation of studies, the FDA took a look at it, took a look at anecdotal information, and said that over the years, while the FDA has received a lot of anecdotal information, it really did not find it causing any adverse effect. In terms of the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, who was asked by the FDA to evaluate the research regarding safety of MSG, they published an article in the Journal of Nutrition which said, again, clean bill of health. And both of these agencies even said it was so safe that it was appropriate for young children, infants, including newborns and preemies, to eat. And earlier this year, you have heard, of course, that the International Headache Society removed MSG as a causative factor. Now, I also want to address that it's important for we as health professionals, for you working with the product, for when we educate about the product, that there may be a subset of people who have an MSG sensitivity. And the most practical thing at that point is to not have it. If you eat MSG or any other food or food ingredient for that matter that causes an adverse effect, then eliminate it from your diet. The bottom line, however, is don't try to eat 3 bottles of MSG at one time.
It's the new internet sensation.
Yes, and just want to give you some references. This is the website from the World Umami Forum. And so you can go ahead and go online and access a lot of the research that we are referencing and have been referencing during this meeting.
Did everybody get their photo of that? Great. Tia, would you take us on?
Yeah, thank you.
There you go.
Hello, thank you all. Let's see here. So my name's Tia Rains. I am with Ajinomoto, and I've been there 4 months. And so what I thought I would do is kind of tell the story of why I'm here and why I think it's so important that, that we're all here to be part of this shift. So my myth that I'm going to discuss is MSG science is generally well known within the food and nutrition community. And the reason why I wanted to discuss this is because I've been part of the food and nutrition community for about the past 20 years. In fact, my journey, I learned yesterday that chefs don't talk about their career, they talk about their journey, not with air quotes though. My journey started at Kraft Foods 20 years ago in 1998. And I was hired as a nutrition scientist. And I was hired at a time when sodium reduction was really the main focus of the entire food industry. As a nutritionist, I was beating that drum to the product developers about we got to reduce the sodium. I apparently people got irritated with me and made me a product developer. So I made Easy Mac and tried to get the sodium out of Easy Mac. And reflecting back on that, we didn't talk about MSG. That didn't even come up as an ingredient that we would consider using to try to reduce the sodium of those products. I left Kraft, continued in the industry, working in different sectors. Again, never once really heard about MSG being discussed as a potential solution to get that sodium down in some of these processed food products. The dietitians in the room, how many of you saw that 2010 Institute of Medicine report that listed MSG as a strategy to reduce sodium? Did anyone see that? Just a handful of people. I missed it, and I was in the food industry, and that was part of my job, was to read those types of publications, and I just didn't know really any of the science about MSG. I knew it was out there. I didn't care much about it. I didn't select products based on a claim on the front, or I didn't avoid Chinese restaurants. I love Chinese restaurants and frequent them as much as I can, but I really was not in the know. And when I found out that Ajinomoto was starting this project, that's when I got really interested, because I thought, what do they know that I don't know? They must know something to be willing to take on this initiative and start to change perceptions on MSG. So like any scientist, I started doing my research. First I was looking at some different public health organizations, and this is what I came up with here. Not very positive. This is the likes of the American Heart Associations. I think one of these is Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic. Certainly not anything that got me really excited about what was going on. And then I got into the PubMed research. And we have only seen here what's been presented is a tiny fraction of the science that's out there on not only the safety, but the benefits of consuming MSG, both from a satiety standpoint, which we haven't talked much about, and also the sodium reduction piece. I just want to point out, it's the bottom, this quote here, I just threw this on. There's a misperception that MSG might cause health problems, but no well-designed studies have reliably found this connection. That's a fair statement. Dr. Oz's website. What a weird world where Dr. Oz has the most accurate statement about MSG. Anyway, so thanks. Once I found out about this science and just the depth and the breadth of it, it struck my nutrition chord. And all of us that are in nutrition, we're not here for fame and glory, right? We don't pursue a career for that reason. We're here because we believe in something about diet and health relationships. And what really gets me motivated is when there's these disconnects between the science and what people believe. And I couldn't pass up the opportunity to be part of that transition and part of that sea change, or whatever we're calling it here today, and start to actually get people the accurate information and get them to believe it, which we will talk about in a little bit, about MSG. So thank you.
Thanks, Tia. You have 6 more seconds.
Oh, and thank you again.
Okay. Dan?
Thanks. Wait, first, Mary Lee, I have a question. When your mom put the MSG on food, did she add it while cooking or sprinkle on at the end?
She put it on at the end.
Okay. All right, I'm taking notes here. So my name is Dan. I host a food podcast called The Sporkful, and we did an episode earlier this year, and the name of the episode, it was entitled "This Podcast Contains MSG." And it delved into the science and debunked a lot of the myths around the faulty science that has been used in the past around MSG. It also got into a lot of the racial bias that underlies a lot of the misperceptions. And it was interesting to see the reaction, because certainly I expected some people to not like it, and some people did not like it. Then the episode began with me basically saying, my name is Dan and I cook with MSG. And then I said, and if you come over to my house, there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to put MSG in the food and I'm not going to tell you. and people especially didn't like that. But you know, I've only ever had satisfied customers in my dinner parties. And what was interesting about the reaction that we got to that episode was, you know, it broke down into several different groups. There was the group that was upset, and roughly speaking, I would say that the reaction broke down along generational lines more than anything. The somewhat older listeners, you know, they were the people who had been told in the 70s and 80s, MSG's horrible. These were the people who came at me with stories like, you know, I ate Chinese food in 1982, and I had a terrible headache afterwards. MSG is evil. You're terrible. How could you do this? You know, this is a terrible show. But among the younger generation of listeners, there was a very different reaction. It was either, for people of color, and especially Asian Americans and some Latino Americans, the reaction was, I grew up with MSG as a common ingredient in my household, like Mary Lee talked about, and yet every time I left my house, I saw signs with the window of every Chinese restaurant, no MSG. And so it was a source of shame for a lot of people, and so there was a lot of those listeners were very gratified and felt validated to hear our episode because they had been made to feel ashamed of the food they grew up eating at home. Then there was the people who didn't have an especially strong connection to MSG, pro or con. They hadn't really been, they didn't come of age in the heart of anti-MSG paranoia, but it also wasn't something they grew up eating. And these are just younger people who are interested in food. And their reaction was, oh wow, I always heard MSG was really bad, but I didn't know why. You know, they didn't have that firsthand experience at the Chinese restaurant. But yet this vague notion in the ether of MSG is evil had somehow kind of like, they had absorbed it through osmosis. And they were thrilled. They were like, this is great. I'm going out to buy a lot of MSG immediately. And they were tweeting me and Instagram, Facebook, all these photos of people coming home with sacks of all different MSG products saying, how should I use it? What should I put it in? I'm cooking tonight. Can't wait to try MSG. And that was exciting. It was exciting for me to see those kinds of reactions. And certainly what I took from it is that this is the idea that most people are against MSG is a myth. That there is definitely, especially among a younger generation, an increasing awareness that there's nothing inherently wrong with it, that it can make your food very delicious, that many millions, billions of people have been eating it for a very long time without any issue, and that it's something that we should open our minds to. And so that was exciting for me to share that with listeners, and it was exciting to see that reaction. And now, when I have my New Year's Day brunch, I make Bloody Marys, and I put Maggi sauce in the Bloody Marys. You got to get your European Maggi, because sadly the American Maggi doesn't have MSG in it. But you get the European one or some of the ones from Asia, and a little dash of that in your Bloody Mary goes a long way. And people keep coming back to my New Year's Day party. So more satisfied customers. All right.
Thanks, Dan.
Right.
Jason?
You got a clicker there?
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Jason Reese. I spent most of my career as a business school professor, and now I'm a full-time consultant. My company's called Behavioralize. It's dedicated to applying behavioral science to two main problems. These are the two main problems I've always been interested in as an academic, and that the field of behavioral science is also largely devoted to. And the two problems are behavior change and critical thinking. In behavior change, we're looking at ways of making it easier for people to do the kinds of things they want to do, to change their behavior towards things like eating more vegetables. It's a hard thing for most people to do, but in America, people consume about half the amount of fruits and vegetables that public health and nutrition people recommend. And I think that's a story we may want to come back to later. The main story here, though, is the second problem around critical thinking. How can we think more smartly about anything, foods in particular? So the myth that I'm going to talk about is people know why they believe what they believe. And psychologists have known for a long time that that's not true. Our paradigm framework, you may have heard of it, It's often referred to as the System 1, System 2 framework. It's been around for decades, but was popularized by my old postdoc, doctoral fellowship advisor. He was advising me, not the other way around. He won the Nobel Prize in economics as a psychologist in 2002. Daniel Kahneman, you may have heard of his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. System 1 thinks fast. It's automatic, and that is what guides most of our behavior. The part that makes us feel human is System 2. The part that slows down and is deliberative and is where we have our explanations. And we come up with explanations, and we feel that that System 2 is the real us. But for the most part, it's not. It's System 1 that drives most of our behavior. Let me give you some examples. This is a visual illusion. I don't know if you can see color well enough to see those blue lines. If you can, the thick blue lines kind of at the end of each of the spokes are not moving. They are not changing in length. You're not crazy. Something is changing. It's the little angled chevron lines that are changing throughout. Those are moving, and they make it look like the blue lines are moving. System 1 tells you that the blue lines are moving, and even though I'm telling you now, your System 2, that they're not moving, and you can almost convince yourself that they're not, you almost can't help yourself but see those lines as moving when they're static. And I think that's a great metaphor for how a lot of thinking works. System 2 chases after System 1. It never quite catches it. If we didn't have active System 1 that made fast decisions and reactions for us, we wouldn't be able to get anything done throughout the day. So you look at food, and you have immediate System 1 reactions. That food is familiar. That food looks good. That happens in a matter of milliseconds. You look at people, and you have those same fast reactions. That person is familiar. That person looks good, or that person does not look good. You have those reactions immediately. And you have the same thing for ideas. That idea is familiar. That idea sounds right. That's how we think. The more elaborate thoughts come after with System 2, but System 2 is very often just explaining our immediate reactions. Let me give you some examples of the kinds of terms and phenomena that us psychologists or behavioral scientists talk about. One of the most important ones is the affect heuristic. And this is the idea that explanations follow feelings, not the other way around. We don't explain things and understand them and then have emotional reactions. This man is afraid of flying. And you can tell him, look, mile for mile, flying is much safer than driving. And that is not going to change the way that he feels. He can't change the way he feels that quickly. System 1 is quite stable and tough to budge. And this makes critical thinking difficult because we can't help but be motivated and driven and compelled by our emotional reactions to things. We know things that we don't really know. We think we know things that we don't really know. This is a great study that was done by a British researcher. She asked people to explain how a bicycle works. She first asked them, do you know how a bicycle works? Not just do you know how to ride it, but do you know how it works? And people say, yeah, of course I know how a bicycle works. And then you get them to start their explanation with a drawing of what a bicycle looks like. And people would draw images like this that, they're missing some important features. For example, the pedals being connected to the gears in the chain. So we may not know things in detail as much as we really think we do, even though we're familiar with them. Two more. Social goals. Our goals in understanding the world are very often driven by a desire to please our tribe, not a desire to get at the truth. When we think about ideas and information, we immediately think about it in terms of how the people in our lives are going to think about it and how they're going to react. Are they going to like it? My tribe is a science tribe, so I think about how scientists are going to like the idea. And that's a heuristic, that's a shortcut that I take, and usually that's a good one. But that's not critical thinking. The last one I'll mention is confirmation bias. I love red wine, and I want it to be good for me, so I love articles like this that suggest there are a bunch of ways in which red wine is good for you, but let's face it, it's probably not. That's confirmation bias, looking and selectively choosing information that suits stories that we're already comfortable with. So those are a few examples of why people don't really know why they believe certain things.
Thanks, Jason.
Yep.
Let me follow up with you real quick for a question on that. Are all of these phenomena like confirmation bias and are people who think that they have the understanding, are in a world where everything personalized is the hot topic, where personalized nutrition, personalized music taste, the like monoculture is dispersing.
Yeah.
Do people tend towards one of those phenomena? Like, am I going to be comprised of all of those different types of behaviors? Or is there a chance that maybe I'm more prone to confirmation bias because I think I'm super smart and I like when people tell me that I'm right? Or is it something that we all have a little bit of it and it's just all encapsulated with, like what Andrew was saying yesterday, we all hear things different ways, and it's the old teaching adage of finding the way to speak to people in their own language. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. It's much closer to the latter, that we are all subject to all of these things, and I think it would be very difficult to identify one that you or any individual is particularly prone to. And I don't pretend for a minute that I'm not prone to these things. Kahneman, who literally wrote the book on this, is adamant that he himself is still prone to these biases. He spent a career, an incredibly influential career, studying and identifying and documenting these things, and he himself has remained human and is still prone to all of these. So I think it's tough to identify one particular one. I think we need to have conversations about all of them. There could be a tendency to believe that we're special and that we have great self-insight. Self-insight's fairly limited.
When we're talking about self-insight, so much of that is wrapped up in emotion, and I am also part of the scientist tribe. I even in I don't know dating relationships in college, I found that I had a lot of tendency to understand the way other human beings behave based on my tendency to like pick apart the natural world and be like, oh, look at the fundamental ingredients of why you love me. Like there's an inherent, we like to translate stuff into our own language, and for a lot of people that language is really wrapped up in emotion much more than it is in science. And I'm sure there are parts of my understanding of the natural world that are much more wrapped up in emotion than science. But still, we're at an unprecedented era right now where I think, again, there are some fringe like vilification of science as for a bunch of different socio-political reasons. There's a mistrust, and I think people are saying things louder and more resolutely wrong than they ever have before. Like there's more confidence in being preposterous and being a conspiracy theorist than there ever has been before. So the liner note was, when emotion trumps science, how do you get through? What are strategies there? I wanted to kick it off, Harold. One of the things you and I talked about was exactly what you said. MSG is in everything. It's in every living thing. So it's a little bit harder to parse out for an average human being the ability to separate this thing that we've said a bunch of times. MSG in a shaker is the same as the MSG that's in a tomato or in your omelet for breakfast or in your favorite rice bowl. We're not having to tell people the gluten that you're really afraid of in wheat is the same as the gluten that you are totally fine with in a tomato. Like, it's an unprecedented thing that such a fundamental component of all food is in this prickly position. Based on your writing process of how to constantly evaluate how other people are going to perceive the words you put on a page, is there anything that you've seen of when you're dancing around these issues that are nuanced? How do you find the empathy to put yourself in other people's shoes and explain things where they may be emotionally disinclined to even come with you on that journey?
It's kind of a sentence-by-sentence thing. I'm not sure I can really generalize except to say that I try to do what you just said, which is I write something and then I sit back and I look at it and I try to imagine how people who don't know anything about the subject are going to respond to it, which pieces are missing, what could I say to kind of preclude someone from thinking something unproductive on that particular subject. So I'm always trying to anticipate what what the reader is going to get out of what I've put down.
Do you imagine the reader based on just ignorance of whatever you're talking about? Do you have particular totems of like this type of reader or this type of reader? Or are you just trying to make it so that anybody who looks at this, who has the ability to read and digest the information, will be guided in a methodical and intuitive way?
Again, it's kind of hard to generalize, but so I often have to explain when I give talks with professional groups that I myself am not a professional in food science or whatever the group happens to be, which I have actually decided over the years has been an advantage, because I come to the things I write about as an outsider. And so I have to learn. I have to work to understand what's going on in things that I'm fascinated by and motivated to understand, but I wasn't steeped in it from when I was a student, that kind of thing. So I'm always coming at it, I think, from a position closer to the average reader than a specialist in that particular subject. And I think maybe that's part of what informs what I do.
Jason, is mistrust of specialists a thing now?
Yes.
Of like insider knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, mistrust of specialists is certainly a thing. Is it worse than it used to be? I mean, the evidence goes kind of both ways on that. But I think there's some great opportunities here. I mean, the scientific fields themselves are becoming more accountable. They're acknowledging when studies fail to replicate and are now making much better efforts to make sure that the stuff that gets published and talked about for a long time is stuff that does replicate and is robust and holds up. So I'm something of an optimist on the trust of science issue. I think science will get it right, and there's just no denying how we benefit from science in our lives. People, we're obsessed with our devices, and that all comes from science. So we know the good that science does.
Tia, as a insider in like two ways, because you work at Ajinomoto and you're also 20 years deep in the field of nutrition, when you talk to people, is there a moment where you say, I used to work at Kraft? Do people perceive your objective expertise in the field of nutrition differently when they know that you were working with Easy Mac?
Yes, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think I've tried to always maintain that I'm a scientist that works in the food industry. I'm not a food industry scientist. And I think is a group of us that have elected to go into the food industry, we all need to do a better job of that, of making it clear that our position there is to represent either nutrition or some aspect of science. And now you're getting in, like, this is a hot button issue for me now. So I think what people don't realize is that it's probably much harder to be a scientist, nutritionist in particular, in the food industry than it is outside. Because a lot of what you do is say no. And in fact, at Kraft, they were calling us the no-tritionists. Because, true story, because you're constantly you got a marketer that comes up and says, and this is another true story, I want to make a beverage that cures colds and flu. And I said, okay, make the directions say wash your hands first before you eat it. It's the only way that we'll get there, because you just can't do that. It's not substantiated. So I think it is very tough. I hope that it's getting better in the future, but it's a challenge having the same degree, the same blood, sweat, and tears, and getting the degree that other people have, and you're somehow treated differently because of the employer that you work for.
Mary Lee, have you had any sort of similar experience as somebody also in this field, as somebody who likes to talk about hot button issues, as somebody Chinese talking about this issue? I mean...
Absolutely. I think for my tribe of registered dietitians here, we really bank on the science. And so we will cite one study after another proving our point of view. But I also think it's really important as health professionals to understand, as Jason said, we all have biases. And when that idea was first couched to me, I going like, oh no, I'm a scientist, I don't have any bias. And then when I started to look at the studies I was accessing, I thought, oh, I believe this because it supports my point of view, and this one might be a little bit more suspect. So the understanding that we all have biases, even when we try to hew very closely to the science, is very important. And the other thing I try to do is to give people options. This is what I have, but also go to these resources and take a look based on your feelings, your emotions, and your evaluations of what you consider the truth, so to speak. And early on when I first started studying nutrition, nothing was controversial. The most controversial thing was whether we should have 4 food groups or 5 food groups, right? That's how old I am. Now you mention anything in food, it's controversial. And that's why I think it's really critical for people who are health educators to really understand not only what the science says, but also what people believe. And when we do education, talk with them not just pure on science, but an acceptance of their value systems and what's important to them too. And that's how we can be more persuasive when we provide education.
I love that as a tack. Dan, can I talk to you about a means of having that conversation?
Sure.
So I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to podcasts about podcasting sometimes. One of the things that I really, that I enjoy, but it also just trips me out as a self-analytical person, is I feel like I know you, and we met like 20 minutes ago, because you've been talking to me while I fold my laundry for like a couple years. There is something about podcasting, there's something about the way that our media conversations are changing, specifically podcasting. It feels like the personalized bully pulpit. It's something where you get to have a personal conversation with an expert that is coming straight, not just into your room where your TV is, but it will follow you around on your commute to work, and it can be an incredible relationship with a listenership. And when you talk about MSG or any food issue, have you found that your audience, how well do you know your audience? Do you know where they generally are, where they're from? And does that help you when putting together a piece, tailor together like some aerodynamics to help get through people's emotional hangups when you're trying to unveil something, or are you just taking your own personal spin, your own personal approach, your own personal style, and hoping that people find it and enjoy it?
Right. That's a really good question. First, I just want to say one quick thing that just kind of piggyback on what Mary was saying, which is, food has become, I guess it probably always has been, food is a stand-in for identity. And so, so a lot of our tribes are based on what we eat. And increasingly now there's the vegetarians and the vegans and the raw vegans and the cooked vegans and the this and the that. And there's almost a cultish connection to these different groups and these battle lines that are drawn. And so I think that's why it's especially hard to shake people's ideas about what they should and shouldn't be eating, because it's not just a discussion about science, it's a discussion about identity. And when you tell someone that the choices they've made about what they should or should not eat are somehow incorrect, they take it as a personal attack on their identity. And that's a really hard thing to shake. That gets you beyond the world of like, which scientific study should you be looking at, In terms of the podcast, I think you're right that one of the reasons why I love audio, and I started in radio and transitioned to podcasting, and I've worked in audio, spoken word audio content for 20 years. One of the reasons why I love it is I feel like that there's an especially personal connection with your audience. I don't think there's any overnight sensations in audio. Like, no, podcasts don't go viral. Even Serial, the This American Life spinoff, which is the closest thing that's ever happened, like a viral video goes viral in one day. cereal didn't go viral in a day. It took weeks and months for it to build and crescendo. So it's a slower process of connecting with someone in audio, but when you connect with someone in audio, the connection is deeper, I think. And I personally think that's because the audio medium is inherently interactive. You're always imagining. You're imagining what the people who you're listening to look like, and the room that they're in, and where they're going, and what they're eating, or whatever it is they're doing. You are forced to generate part of the experience in your own head. You know, like people are always, when I first started out, people would be like, how can you do a food podcast? Food is so visual. The podcast is the best way to do food, because if I show you a picture of a delicious cheeseburger, like, yeah, it'll look delicious, it'll probably make your mouth water. But if I tell you a story about a cheeseburger that leads you to picture your platonic ideal of a cheeseburger, or a cheeseburger you have actually eaten and loved, well, the experience will resonate with you that much more deeply. So I feel that that's true, and I hope that because I've developed a relationship with listeners over many years through the audio medium, that when we do a story about something like MSG, it will resonate that much more deeply. And so hopefully for some of the people who were in the middle, or heard some kinds of vague ideas but weren't so invested in it, we were more able to convince them because of that. But in terms of the people who this is their identity and they're rock solid, I'll be honest, I don't know that the medium will make the difference.
But time may make a difference. I mean, I think just using the demeanor that you seem to exude of familiarity and likability enhances the possibility of trust, and it's that familiar experience that people need to change their emotional reactions over time. So you couch ideas in terms of things that are familiar to them. You describe consumption patterns in terms of social identities that are familiar to them. You make it seem normal to do these smart things that they ought to be doing. And we just help everybody keep calm.
That point of time is great. I want to jump on that. And this kind of thing has happened before, maybe not on this scale, and maybe not with something as ubiquitous as one of the fundamental pillars of how we detect things chemically in our mouths. But to open it up to the panel as a whole, I'd love to spend just 5 minutes talking about other instances in our past as a civilization where an ingredient has had a struggle and has then come to the fore. I mean, one of the classic ones is like an avocado. You guys remember the 90s? I said this yesterday. Fat was going to kill us all immediately. Fat was going to go straight into your bloodstream, and like that avocado fat was going to like personally clog your arteries. And now here we are with avocados. Are there other examples of foods that have had this rise and fall, or maybe a rise and fall and rise again, or whatever that curve looks like?
Well, definitely when you take a look at things like eggs, nuts, the avocados, there are so many food fears. When you talk about fear of fat in the 90s, and now because we have new research and it's been promoted and we've done more education, people understand that not all fat is bad, some fat is necessary, there are different kinds of fat. So in the process, maybe we've pulled back a little bit from fear of fat, but now people say, oh, I'm confused, what's good fat or bad fat? So sometimes a little bit too much education can be difficult too, but we have to couch it in real life terms. Okay, what is your value? Well, people always value food that tastes good. If you don't have umami, if you don't have fat, the food isn't going to taste as good. So I use a lot of for examples when I talk. So when I talk about a food fear, so to speak, that a consumer has, I really want to make it real to the person, that they can access that information and put it in their everyday life and feel good about doing it. Plus they get some pleasurable sensations too, as the food tastes good, or I'm doing something good for my family, or I know I'm providing some safe food. I think that's important to just not go with the straight information, but put it in context for their life.
If I could just add to that, I mean, I think that, Mary, you said some really good examples from recent history of the way that science has changed, or the public opinions about foods have changed with the science. But then there's also another component with MSG, which is, I mean, like the first example I think of with your question is Italian food. 100 years ago, public health experts were warning about the dangers of Italian food. They said it's got too much garlic, it's too spicy. This is why Italians have hot tempers, because they have garlic in their food. These are the kinds of things that people said. And one of the things that most profound lessons I've learned working on some of the podcast episodes we've done on these kinds of issues of food and identity and race and culture, there's a guy named Professor Krishnendu Ray. He chairs the food studies department at NYU. He does fantastic work. And what I've learned from him is, we tend to correlate our perceptions of an immigrant group, of the people, with their food. And so when the negative stereotypes about Italian immigrants 100 years ago were they're low class, they're uneducated, they're in the mafia, they're dangerous, therefore their culture is not worth our time, and their food is dirty. And so it was a conflation of the people and the food. As Italian immigrants and Italian Americans have assimilated in American culture, and as they have moved up the socioeconomic ladder, so has their food. Why do we pay more for Italian food than Mexican food? Italian food is not so expensive to make. Like, pasta is just dough. Like, I mean, it's more than that, but like the raw materials are not necessarily so incredibly expensive, but we'll pay $20 for a plate of pasta. Very few people would pay $20 for an entree at a Mexican restaurant. Well, Professor Ray would say that it's because our perception of Mexican culture is that it's not as valuable, because our perception of Mexican immigrants is that they are lower class. Indian food has ascended very quickly in America since an influx of Indian immigrants in the 60s and 70s. But 70% of the Indian immigrants who've come here are college educated. So our perception of them, of the Indian immigrants that we encounter, is that they are educated, and therefore their culture must be ranked more highly, or should be valued more highly. And when in fact, Mexico actually is a wealthier country than India per capita. Mexico is a middle-class country compared to the world as a whole. So our stereotypes and prejudices about immigrant groups get transferred onto the food, and I think that's a lot of what's changing with the perceptions of umami and the perceptions of MSG. And that's why you start to see now more and more people understanding that American Chinese takeout food is not really Chinese food, and more high-end people are now willing to pay more money for Chinese food and Japanese food and Vietnamese food and Thai food. And so these are the things that I think are really changing about perceptions that are going to make a huge difference in the way that people perceive these ingredients.
Didn't homogenized processed white bread arise in response to the vilification of darker whole grain breads as a food safety risk because unclean immigrants were making it?
I'll let someone else talk in more detail, but I would just tell you that the original slogan for Wonder Bread when it first launched was "untouched by human hands." That was they were bragging. Now think about artisanal everything now, right? Can you imagine the bragging that no human ever touched this product? And I would just add real quick to my previous thought, like, it is unfortunate that every immigrant group that comes and their food have to go through this process of judgment and eventual exoneration. It would be nicer if we could skip ahead to the assumption that everyone's food has value, but I'm just telling you what the pattern has been in the past.
Your question about white bread, I think, is really interesting and goes back, way back in history, where white flour, white rice, anything white grain was viewed as upper class because it was the more economically stable people who could afford it, and then the poor people ate the brown stuff. So I came home at Thanksgiving for my first year at school, and I learned in my nutrition class that brown rice is better. So I served that to my mom, and she looked at that bowl of brown rice, and she said, if I'd known you wanted to be a peasant, we would have stayed in China. So there's a real cultural component to that too. And fortunately, I think because nutrition science has changed, now we know that the brown rice, the brown flour, the whole wheat bread is better for you. But now we also have white flour that is very high in fiber. So there's a whole evolution around that of what people look as healthy and as good and as socioeconomically advantageous.
it is something that in my day-to-day job, I develop new food products, and we do it in Berkeley, California. So humanity swings back and forth from pole to pole. We're not great at hanging out in the middle. There's some like entropy lesson or enthalpy lesson there. But there are superfoods and there is stuff that's going to kill you tomorrow. It's really hard to talk about anything else. I think we were even talking about how one of the things that is missing is maybe some studies of what MSG can do that is positive. I would actually hate for MSG to ever be touted as a superfood, because I think that's just a weird reductive thing. That's like saying water is just the greatest superfood. You should all try it. Is there something open to everybody? Is there something that is missing from this conversation so far that can set us up for as much success as can be had talking with humans, of hitting that middle ground of no, this doesn't have to reinforce your joints and make your hair shiny for you to be able to eat it, and it's not going to kill you, or it shouldn't just be something that won't kill you on impact. Like, is there something? I don't know how to phrase this in a way that doesn't sound like disparaging to all of humanity, but like, is there a way that we can hit a middle and stay in that lane without falling prey to this thing that gets us every single time? It's okay, there's not an answer.
Yeah, here are two half ideas. And I'll push this familiarity idea again. I think once there starts to be a new conversation about what MSG is and why it's been a familiar household product in many places for generations and why it should be here again, I think it can start to go into the background. I think it's going to go from villainized to being in the background. I don't think there's typically going to be a jump to superfood, so I don't think we have to worry about that. I think a little more in the background would probably be appropriate here once people start to be more comfortable with it. I think there is an opportunity to become a hero in the food world, not superfood, but a hero. And I alluded to this at the beginning. If we can find a way that MSG can help people eat more vegetables or do the things that public health people agree is healthful. The public health community is not into the villainizing and superfoods. That's a public conversation. But if you can get on the right side of the public health folks who have basically two messages for America: eat fewer calories and eat more vegetables. If MSG can have a role in those things, it's on the high ground, and it's going to be very hard to keep villainizing it.
Yeah.
Can I just
Tia,
build on that?
please do.
So I came from the egg world. We mentioned eggs saw this shift from being villainized to now it went through the neutral, and now they're being seen for some of the positives for different reasons. But I think what really was the major catalyst in that switch was the dietary guidelines for Americans. And I think these public health guidelines, whether it's coming out of USDA or another public health agency or organization, does serve as a catalyst to get more people comfortable with the idea that something is safe or effective. So that would be my wish, would be that we can have more of those documents like the IOM 2010 sodium reduction strategy that lists MSG as it should be, not a superfood or a super seasoning or anything super, but as something that's okay and that can be used to enhance a plant-based healthy diet.
Is superfood, is that an official scientific term?
No.
So that's just good marketing, right? Okay.
Unless I'm real behind. That's not a.
There's no official scientific definition of a superfood. It's just like, today this is a superfood.
Yeah.
Got it.
It's usually bright red. In about 3 minutes, I want to open it up to some audience questions. So take 3 minutes to gestate some ideas. I want to talk for 3 minutes about the war on craveability, which is a buzzword phrase I'm going to coin right now. One of the things that people say about MSG, and something that we even said a lot yesterday in a positive light, was, oh my God, this is going to be such an umami bomb. This is just going to be so deeply satisfying. You said it was MSG is a just potent tool for leveraging deliciousness, even more so than frying could be. A lot of times, the more amorphous negative perception of MSG is that it's somehow this drug that is placed into your food, which is very strange because, again, a lot of our briefs, I'd say 50% of our briefs are we want to make a grain-free, paleo, ketogenic banana cookie, but I want it to taste, I want to get people addicted to it. I want it to be more craveable than a Pop-Tart. And I mean, these are like phrases written in every brief we see. We want these to be snackable. We want you to want to go back for the next one. Harold, that is the point of cooking, yes? To want to continue to eat the good thing that you're eating?
Yes.
Okay, great. Can we like dive in there? Like, is there something? Obviously, looking at a potato chip that maybe has been value engineered to the point of maybe not even containing that much potato anymore. The fact that there are still sensory cues that make it taste good are potentially problematic. I don't know that the driver used to make it taste good itself is in fault. Does everybody agree with that? I mean, it's a thing where the science of crispiness is not one of the things you should warn your children about. And crispiness really helps Doritos be incredible, just as much as umami. And a lot of the umami in a Doritos is coming from cheese powder. It's coming from hydrolyzed yeast. It's coming from all different sources. The fact that it is delicious and craveable and snackable, I don't think is the problem as much as the thing that you're trying to snack on has nothing else to it of nutritive value, right? Can we all agree that there's craveability itself is kind of a fundamental principle of good food?
Yeah, I mean, the calorie people worry about it because some of the most craveable stuff is so energy dense.
Sure.
And it, you know, there's a sense in which it really does create a problem in the American diet. But a calorie neutral product like MSG, I think, can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Right, if you're introducing craveability into a tofu bowl, if you're introducing craveability into eggplant versus bacon, you know, like that kind of thing. I think it's so weird that the craveability itself is vilified or feared when, yeah.
Well, I think it's a little weird. I get what you're saying. I mean, this gets into some difficult shades of gray. I think that, well, I'm not the scientist here, but like, am I right in saying that we agree that sugar is addictive?
No.
No, that's not true? Okay, all right. That's right. I'm not the...
Hey, look over there.
Okay.
Let's talk about something else.
This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is part of the zeitgeist that like things
but
that we want to do a lot are usually bad.
It's certainly craveable. Addictive and craveable are not the same.
And that's really my point. Is that craveable? I think to a lot of people it sounds like a corporate buzzword for addictive, and that it gets you into dangerous territory because if you are intentionally engineering a food that is going to, and I know that there's a scientific definition for the word addictive and it involves withdrawal and maybe it falls just short of that, but if you know that the food is unhealthy and you're going out of your way to get people to eat as much of it as possible and to not be able to stop eating it, then at a certain point, and I can't tell you exactly where the line is, but at a certain point, I think that you bear some responsibility for that. Yeah. But I also think that doesn't mean that it's MSG's fault. But I also think that any company or restaurant developing foods should try to be cognizant of that and to try to put some thought into where that line exists.
Of course. The same thing could be said for smoothies and green drinks, right? Like you're trying to get people to come to your juice bar every single day, and so you build in other cues for this reproducible behavior, whatever they may be. But yeah, anyway, that's something I've always been curious about. Tia,
What
you
about
have
just
one more?
an idea? What about an overlay of the word satisfaction?
Yeah.
Because that to me is you want it to be craveable and you want to feel like it hit the spot and you're good. I think it's when you don't have that satisfaction piece woven into that conversation, that's when it starts to be that slippery slope to, constant in and never having the cues to want to stop eating that product.
Great. Shall we do a couple questions? Do you guys have thoughts?